Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page there and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at SafeCampAudio on all social media. All right, on today's episode, we round out the Rule-a-Palooza series. This is the fourth and final one. As I've mentioned before, we have discussed a lot in the last year about the fact that the Biden administration has been active in terms of making new rules and regulations in the child welfare space. Just wanted to put these together over the summer so that listeners could hear from, not just me, but actual subject matter experts who know what they're talking about and can provide what I think is, we've put together some pretty concise 101 style segments here for people that just want to understand the basics. Why did this happen? What does the rule mean? How are people going to gauge whether it's successful, et cetera, et cetera. So today on this last one, we are talking to Ashley Burnside, Senior Policy Analyst for the Center for Law and Social Policy, who joined to help us break down a rule that would put in some new guardrails about how states can use funds from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which became a federal program in 1996 as part of welfare reform. And I say would put in some new guardrails because this one actually is in the proposed stage, has not yet become final as of when I recorded this. So Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, most people just know it as TANF, is both a potential source of support that could prevent child welfare involvement for some families. And then in some states, it's used pretty widely to fund child welfare services. So Ashley and I kind of explored both parts of that as it relates to this new rule. So without further ado, here is the final Rule-a-Palooza episode for the summer. Ashley Burnside on the proposed changes to the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. We are doing a series of guest interviews on all the new Biden administration rules, and today we are joined by Ashley Burnside, Senior Policy Analyst for the Center for Law and Social Policy, which you probably, if you know them as CLASP. Everybody knows them as CLASP, and she's going to help us break down a rule that has actually not yet become final. It's still in the proposed phase, but would be very consequential both within child welfare and well upstream of it as well on a family policy level. So Ashley, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you more about this today.
Talking TANF. So before we get into that, let's get the folks to know you a little bit, Ashley. I'm going to give you the categories. You've got give me one favorite. You can give me more if you want. TV show or movie, book, sports team, or musical group. What do you got for the folks?
Sports team's the easiest. I love University of Michigan football team. I grew up in Ann Arbor, love watching them. Last year was a great season, obviously, but I love them in their good and bad seasons. TV show, I would have to say Gilmore Girls. Watched that a lot growing up with my mom and sister. Definitely a comfort show for me. And book, was that the other one?
Yeah, you can do book. You've already well exceeded what you need to.
All right.
Yeah, give us a book.
I was going to say book is impossible. I've always loved Middlesex. So I'd say that's definitely a top one for me.
Right. Yeah. Michigan's right down the street from me. We're both Michiganders. In another world before I lived in Michigan, I lived in DC. And while we were building this publication, I hosted trivia on the side. And one of the kind of gimmicks we had was teams getting to pick their own category. Like the third place team got to pick a category. It's a good way to get somebody to come back next week. You lock in one team at least, right? I'm pretty sure by the end, the most frequently chosen category was Gilmore Girls. So it's important to remember it's been a few years now since its heyday. That show was just like, I don't want to pejoratively say cult, but it had a cult following. It was a cult.
No, you're not wrong. And I don't want to brag, but I could do well in that trivia.
I bet you could.
Unfortunately, I never attended.
I'll find the questions and send us some your way.
I'd appreciate that.
So the proposed rule we are going to discuss today is called Strengthening Temporary Assistance for Needy Families as a Safety Net and work program, which is shockingly not the wordiest of all the roles that we've talked about. But temporary assistance for needy families is often just shorthanded to TANF. And I think let's make sure everyone's familiar with the program we're talking about before we get into, what might change and all of that other stuff. So Ashley, maybe we could begin with a little primer on what TANF is, big picture, how it got started, what it's supposed to be doing, all that.
Yeah, I definitely think it's good to start there. So TANF, like you said, stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. TANF was created in 1996 through the passage of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Pact under President Bill Clinton. And it replaced the former Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, or AFDC. The purpose of TANF broadly is to provide monthly cash assistance for families with children who have very low incomes, as well as other services and supports for those children and families. And to give some of the history, prior to TANF, there had been a lot of different programs that provided cash to families with children and with low incomes. Over time, we got to the point where TANF was passed in 1996. And when it was created, it was made into a block grant. And that block grant is a federal pot of money that is given directly to states. And states can spend that money towards families with low incomes to help them achieve economic stability. TANF funds can be spent to go towards monthly cash assistance for families, but states can also spend that money towards work activities, work supports, childcare services, and other programs that serve children and families. In addition to getting federal block grant money, states also are required to spend some of their own money towards the TANF program. This is called the Maintenance of Effort Requirement, or MOE spending. So you have both federal block grant money and state revenue that is going towards the TANF program each year. TANF provides monthly time-limited cash assistance for families who have very low incomes with children. And this cash is generally unrestricted, meaning that families can spend it in whatever way is needed for their household. And that is different than other public benefit programs. For example, SNAP food benefits, you can only really spend towards groceries and food costs.
Right.
And the same is true with housing vouchers. You can only spend that money towards specific housing costs. But with TANF, a family can spend that money towards diapers, clothing, utility bills, really anything that they need to make their expenses met month to month. And that's really important because TANF is exceptional in that it provides this unrestricted cash to families. And we know that when you provide families with cash month to month, that helps them meet the expenses that they need. And research tells us that when you provide families in poverty with cash, especially when their children are young, and especially when children are at their earliest stages of childhood development, that has positive impacts for the child's education outcomes, their health, their future earnings. So I always like to start by saying that when I talk about TANF, because I think sometimes it's often forgotten why this program is important and the potential that it has to serve families. But unfortunately, because of the way that TANF has been structured, it's hard for families to access these benefits. There are work requirements in place that parents have to meet to access benefits. There's a 60-month federal time limit. There's a child support requirement and a lot of other behavioral requirements and earning requirements that can make it really hard for families to access TANF when they're facing financial crises and make it hard for TANF to be there for families when they need it. There's also a lot of flexibility that lawmakers have in how they can spend their TANF block grant dollars. States can choose to spend their dollars in any way that is reasonably calculated to achieve one of the 4 statutory purposes of the program. And I'm actually going to list the purposes off because it is relevant to the proposed rule we'll be talking about, and I think really exemplifies how this program was created by lawmakers. The first purpose is to provide assistance to needy families so that children can be cared for in their own homes or in the homes of relatives. The second is to end the dependence of needy parents on government benefits by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage. The third is to prevent and reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies. And the fourth is to encourage the formation and maintenance of 2-parent families. So as long as a state is spending their TANF dollars in a way that is reasonably calculated when one of those 4 broad purposes, it's generally an allowable use of TANF funds. And this has given states a lot of flex to spend funds in a variety of areas. And over time, fewer and fewer TANF dollars have gone towards monthly cash assistance for families. Instead, states have allocated TANF dollars towards other areas, or even sometimes chosen to not spend the funds at all. To illustrate this point, in 1997, when the program was first created, across the nation, states spent an average of 71% of their TANF basic cash assistance for families. In 2022, only 23% of TANF funds went towards cash assistance for families.
I don't think it's probably like the same answer in every state, but in general, do people like yourself who study this stuff have a general idea of why that's happened? Why have states decided that there are better uses within their flexibility than to just directly send that money to families?
Yeah, the short answer is there's a lot of factors at play, and it is different on a state-by-state basis. But to an extent, I would say one of the reasons is that because there's so much flexibility, there's a lot of pressure for states to reallocate TANF dollars towards other areas of their state budget, because really all states have faced budget shortfalls in recent decades. And when you have this very broad block grant that you can spend towards any area that broadly meets the needs of children and families, it could be tempting to take that money and put it towards another program that is short funded. And over time, the TANF caseload has decreased for a variety of reasons. So when you combine those two factors together, it can be very tempting for state lawmakers to take those dollars and put it towards different areas. And that flexibility in how states can spend their dollars is really important when discussing this proposed rule. It's the biggest theme for why this proposed rule exists, is to really address that flexibility that states.
Okay. Well, I want to get back to that in a second. There's one thing I want to make sure that we also kind of explain to folks. I think within that box of financial assistance to families, check me here if I don't say this right. The traditional way that happens is that it passes directly to a parent, right? To an adult. But then there are also TANF child-only grants, correct? What are those? What's the difference?
Yeah. So the quote-unquote typical TANF household would be a parent with their children, and that's the TANF household. But there are also what are called child-only cases. Basically, is a TANF household where either the parent is not eligible for the TANF benefit, but the child is, so only the child is the recipient, or the child is living with a non-parent adult caretaker, like a grandparent, for example, who is ineligible for the assistance. The most common reason that the parent would be ineligible is either due to them receiving supplemental security income, or SSI, which is a benefit for people with severe disabilities who cannot work, or because the parent is an immigrant and is ineligible for TANF due to their immigration status.
Okay.
But the benefit is going to the child in those cases.
Okay, well, I think you got to some of this, but let's kind of get a little bit more specific, because I've kind of broken these 101s down to kind of 4 parts. And the first part is, what is the problem or set of problems that the rule that we're discussing seeks to solve? Like, what is the status quo beforehand? And I think that you've done well to already explain most of that. I think in this case, actually, let's also kind of break it into 2 parts and kind of do that on a broader level. But then maybe you could explain how these broader issues with TANF impact child welfare policy and funding specifically.
Sure. Yeah. So to start, the problem is that TANF dollars are not always going toward the original intent of the law, and also towards the target population of families with children who have very low incomes. And this proposed rule focuses on the TANF spending requirements. And ultimately, if it becomes law, it would create more guidance to ensure that states are spending their dollars toward the intended purposes of the program and towards the intended target population of the program, these very low-income families with children. Now, the status quo is states have a lot of flexibility in how they can spend their TANF dollars. And over time, fewer dollars have gone towards cash assistance for families with low incomes. Some states have started spending their TANF dollars towards areas of spending that I would say are tangentially related to the original purposes of the program, like towards crisis pregnancy centers. So you have states spending these funds in ways that are more tangentially aligned for purposes I talked about earlier. And because the original law that created TANF was written to intentionally give states so much flexibility to be innovative in how they spent their dollars, there's not always an easy way for agencies and lawmakers to hold states accountable in how they choose to spend their TANF funds. And there's not an easy way for states to know what is or is not allowable when you have these broad purviews. So this proposed rule would create more guidance to hold states accountable in how their funds are able to be spent. It would create more clear metrics for what classifies a needy family, for example. So I do think it could begin to address the problem we're talking about. To be clear, this proposed rule would not wave a magic wand and magically solve all of the complex issues that I see in this program. But I do think it'd be a step in the right direction of looking at how states are spending TANF dollars.
So there was basically, the way to look at it might be there was intentional flexibility built into TANF to allow states legally and, with the consent and endorsement of Congress and everybody to use this for different reasons. But over time, that line has been frayed. And there are, it sounded like from the rules and from what you're saying, there are just myriad examples that people have come to know where it's like, that does not count.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. The first is exactly right, that PERORA, or the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, one of the wonkiest acronyms in DC.
PERORA. It just sounds like a word, yeah.
Yeah, it was not written for a good acronym. But PERORA was created intentionally in ways to give states flexibility, partly to be innovative. The idea at one point was that states could do different types of pilot programs to serve families with low incomes and helping them to find employment or to find social services. And in an ideal world, discover ways to best support families for their unique local economies and state economies. But in practice, that flexibility has not been a good thing in a lot of instances. Mm-hmm. The second part that I think is worth to name is when we go way back to the predecessor of TANF, ADC and AFDC. When it was first created, President Roosevelt did want to create a federal benefit benchmark for the program, but there were a lot of lawmakers from southern states that pushed back on that and wanted the program to have local and state jurisdiction where local and state lawmakers could decide the eligibility and benefit levels. And that ultimately is what became law. So we have a history of cash programs being state administered. And that, I think, did also follow TANF to what we have today.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
Okay, so most rules come down to, the rules, so it's a little bit more than that. But as you described, it's issuing guidance. Let's call it guardrails where there weren't before. So let's get into that in as layman's terms as possible. What specific things are changed or established if this becomes a final rule? Like, what are these guardrails that are going to be in place now to kind of rein in the flexibility a bit?
There are really three big changes this proposed rule would be making to TANF spending. So I'm going to break down each of those three things. The first thing the rule would do is define a needy family at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. Earlier, I talked about how states can spend their TANF funds towards one of the four purposes of the program. Any spending that goes towards purposes 1 and 2 must go towards a needy family. That's written in the statute of the law. But a state gets to define what a needy family is, and different states have very different definitions. Some states are using higher income definitions of a needy family, representing families making up to 400% of the federal poverty line, for example. And what that means is that in some states, TANF dollars go towards families with very low incomes. Instead, they're able to reach families making more moderate to high incomes because of the threshold the state is using to define what a needy family is. So this rule gives states flexibility because they still can decide what the threshold is for a needy family, so long as it's at or below that 200% cap that the proposed rule is making. So it's still ensuring that the TANF dollars are being targeted towards families with low incomes while also giving states that flexibility. The second proposed change that this rule would be making is creating what's called a reasonable person standard test to ensure that state TANF spending is reasonably aligned with the program goals. This will be done by creating a metric that a reasonable person would define state spending as going towards one of the four purposes. And if an expenditure doesn't meet that test, then that would no longer be allowable for a state to spend TANF funds in that way. The third is to remove what's called third-party MOE spending. I was talking earlier about how states are required to spend a certain amount of dollars of their own money each year towards a TANF program called maintenance of effort spending, or MOE. Under current law, states are allowed to claim spending from nonprofits and other third parties like food banks toward their MOE spending requirement. This ultimately means that some states can spend fewer of their own dollars towards families with low incomes because they're able to count this existing spending by nonprofits that are serving those communities. This rule would remove that option and say that states are no longer able to count third-party MOE spending towards their spending requirement. So to reiterate, the three changes are defining a needy family at or below 200% of the federal poverty line, 2, creating a reasonable person standard test, and 3, removing the third-party MOE spending requirement.
Gotcha.
And there are a few other small technical changes in the proposed rule, but I would say those are the real substantive changes that are going to make the biggest impact.
That was a really good breakdown of all this. So to tie this back before we get it kind of into, what folks like yourself are going to be doing around this rule if it becomes final and all that, I just want to bring it down to child welfare for a bit, because as Ashley kind of correctly pointed out, I think the biggest, role of TANF and potential from this change would be, we have a growing body of research that suggests that of the benefits of providing more direct cash and meaningful concrete supports to parents is that it has an ameliorative effect on people having anything to do with child welfare. So it's really an upstream investment in preventing families from coming into that world at all. But the proposed rule language for this really does kind of quite specifically call out some states' expenditures on child welfare as being kind of in the realm of problematic. I think it's going to quickly read from one part of it. A portion of the close to $2 billion spent on covering costs in state child welfare systems is being justified as providing assistance to needy families, but those expenditures appear to be covering ordinary operating costs of state child welfare systems and not targeted to meet the goal of preventing children from entering foster care. So it does seem like, of the things that they are looking to rein in and kind of limit states on child welfare and the use of this kind of TANF to cover foster care is certainly one of them, right?
Because this proposed rule has the reasonable person standard, that could impact the child welfare spending in some states. A lot of states currently spend TANF funds towards child welfare as an allowable way for states to spend their TANF dollars. And there are some child welfare spendings that I believe would still be allowable under this proposed rule. But like you just identified, the proposed rule does name some existing areas of spending that would potentially not meet this reasonable person standard. For example, like you said, the operating costs of state child welfare systems, child protection investigations. One of the purposes of the program of TANF is that it's supposed to help ensure that children can remain in their own homes. When you have something like a child protection investigation, that's kind of contradicting that rule by its nature. So if a state is currently spending their TANF funds towards that area, they would likely need to find a new revenue source to fund that area to be in compliance. I'll also name that the needy family part of the proposed rule also could impact some child welfare spending in some states. There are some states where TANF funds are going towards child welfare services for families that are making up to 500% of the federal poverty line. So that could potentially contradict the new definition of needy families, which is at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. That's something else the preamble of the rule identifies. So Similarly, if a state is currently spending TANF funds towards families with higher incomes and child welfare services, they may need to find a new funding source for that population. This really varies on a state-by-state basis. TANF funding is so varied in how it looks on a state-by-state level. So I do encourage listeners, if you're in a particular state and you want to know how this proposed rule would impact your state, it's worth looking at the federal data from the Administration for Children and Families and seeing how your state is spending TANF funds, what percent is going towards child welfare, and what services within child welfare are being funded. And that will give you a better picture of how this proposed rule would be impacting your specific jurisdiction, because it really will look different across the different states.
100%. There's some states where it's almost zero. And there's some states where an enormous percentage of their child welfare spending comes from TANF, or vice versa, an enormous chunk of their TANF goes to child welfare. One thing it seemed like that would be safe, but tell me if I'm wrong. Maybe the needy family income standards would change this, but it doesn't seem like the child-only grants that we talked about earlier, which in the child welfare world, largely that goes to caregivers like grandparents or uncles or aunts who are caring for a child, would not be outside the bounds under this rule. Would those new income standards possibly affect child-only grants or no?
You're correct that I do not foresee child-only grants being in any way impacted, because that is directly aligned with Purpose 1 of TANF, which is to provide assistance to families so children can be cared for in their own homes or the homes of relatives. That is exactly what child-only cases are doing. It's providing monthly benefits to families that either have a non-parent caretaker or parents who are not eligible, to ensure that the child can remain in the home. And child-only cases, oftentimes the income of the parent or the non-parent adult caretaker is not counted towards the income threshold of the household. It's just the income of the child being counted. So that is a bit different than cases. Yeah. So to answer your question, no, I don't foresee that being impacted.
Most of the rules that we've kind of done these reviews on this summer are final. This one, we've yet to see that language. So it's still, they put out a proposed rulemaking, and then they get the comments, and then there's a review period, and we still don't know whether it's going to go final or not. But if it does, what are CLASP and other organizations that are really focused on family policy and federal spending doing to engage states, or what do you plan to do to sort of engage folks after this rule theoretically becomes the rule, the final rule?
I think the most important thing for all organizations, CLASP and others, to be doing is making sure state agencies, state lawmakers, and state advocates understand what this rule is and the impacts it will have. It's very in the weeds, but as we've talked about, it has huge implications for how some states will be spending their TANF dollars. And it creates an advocacy opportunity, because in some states, you may now have TANF funds that were previously going towards an area that will no longer be allowable based on either the needy person change or the reasonable person test. And that pot of money is now newly available to go towards a different area in the state budget. So there could be an opportunity to advocate that states are spending these funds in ways to really help families, whether that be towards increasing the monthly benefit for families, toward providing short-term recurrent benefits. There's a lot of ways that states could be supporting families with low incomes that aren't currently happening because these TANF dollars are going towards other areas of the budget. So I do think it'll be really important for organizations like CLASP to be supporting states as they're reconfiguring their state budgets and how their TANF funds are spent, to be in compliance with this rule, to think about the best way that they can be spending these dollars to meet the needs of families within their state. We have a lot of research that tells us how we can best help families who are facing financial emergencies. And a lot of that research shows that providing cash directly to people when they're facing a financial crisis is very effective. So I do think that this proposed rule could create a really exciting opportunity for states to reimagine how their state TANF program operates, who it's serving, and what services are being provided.
I think that's a good segue to the last question here for you, Ashley, which is, let's just imagine that this rule becomes final and maybe takes effect, next year or whatever. How will we know if this had an impact in, let's say, 5 years? What would you consider the evidence of success? What do you, CLASP, plan to measure and hold this rule accountable with?
Yeah, first I'd say there's kind of the nuts and bolts answer. If we see that states are spending their TANF funds towards families with lower incomes, that we're really targeting that needy family threshold of 200% more directly. If we're seeing states spending their TANF funds towards areas that more reasonably align and no longer towards these areas that would likely be identified as not meeting the reasonable person standard. And if we see more states investing more of their MOE dollars because they can't count the third-party MOE spending, all of that, I would argue, would be clear metrics of success because it shows that the proposed rule is having the exact outcome it's intending for and how states are spending their TANF dollars. But to go more broadly, I would like to hope that the TANF program would be more effectively serving families with low incomes and really aligning with the original program intent. I would love to see what I was describing earlier, state agencies and advocates and stakeholders coming together to reimagine how they're spending their TANF funds in their state, to reevaluate where money is going to help low-income families, and to try to use the research available to assess what are the best ways to support families in our state that are facing a financial emergency, and to invest their TANF dollars towards those areas to really ensure that different states are meeting the needs of families living in poverty. To me, that would be a really exciting indicator that this proposed rule has made a positive impact. And I'll just name again that this proposed rule is just one step, right? Even if this passes as is written, there's still going to be a lot of ways that TANF could be improved, a lot of which would need to pass out of Congress. And there's a lot of things that states could choose to do to improve their TANF programs. States have a lot of flexibility in how their programs are administered. But I am hopeful that if this proposed rule were to be final, it would put a lot of states on a path to investing their TANF funds differently in a way that's best meeting the needs of families with very low incomes and that's helping families achieve economic stability.
Ashley Burnside, Senior Policy Analyst for the Center for Law and Social Policy. Thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Ashley Burnside, Senior Policy Analyst for the Center for Law and Social Policy, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCampAudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's super easy. Visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.